Then I'm going to make you host again. Okay.
Okay.
Well, welcome to the periodic webcast for the Syracuse Intellectual Property Law Institute and Technology Commercialization Law Program at Syracuse University College of Law. It's my pleasure to welcome Professor Ana Santos Rachman from the St. Louis University School of Law and the Center for Health Studies at the St. Louis University Law School. Professor Rachman did a very excellent webinar for us a few years ago on pandemics, and unfortunately, I guess the circumstances made us think of having her come back and talk about the current situation. So welcome, Professor Rachman, and I'll pass it on to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me again. As we were discussing just before the presentation began, I really wish I was not doing this today, although it's a pleasure to be a part of this series again. These are not the circumstances I'd wish to be here for. That being said, it is timely to think, in the midst of all that's happening, to think about intellectual property and the ways in which it has affected, is affecting, and is likely to affect the development of things like vaccines, which you have certainly heard a lot about the topic recently. And one of the ways that this pandemic might come to an end is through the development of a coronavirus vaccine targeting this new pathogen. So I thought that I would talk about some of the things I did discuss in my first webcast for the Syracuse IP Law Institute, and then present some of the research I've done in between. So the first podcast took place in 2017, just on the heels of the Ebola and Zika outbreaks. And to put things into perspective, the first approved Ebola vaccine was finally cleared by the FDA in December of last year, so December 2019, a few years after the big Ebola outbreak of 2014-2016, which in itself, it's a really, really expedited timeline for vaccine development, testing, and regulatory approval. And now in the current pandemic, we are hearing the possibility of vaccines being developed in about a year to a year and a half, which, we'll see if that is true, but that's the R&D pipeline functioning at an unusual speed. Obviously, given the public health stakes here, it's understandable, but it's unusual, and IP has something to do with that. So I thought that I could start with a little bit of some background info, sort of what does IP have to do with all of this, speaking to not only the different roles that intellectual property has in the development of new vaccines, but also just about vaccines themselves as a good, and particularly as a form of technology, which is, I think, something we don't usually think about when we think about vaccines. We think about syringes, we think about needles, we think about tools for public health promotion, but they are a form of technology subjected to the same, or many of the same rules that regulate technological advancements in many, many other areas that might not have anything to do with biotechnology. So I'll first provide that background information. I'll talk about the roles of intellectual property in the development of vaccines, and particularly I'll focus on vaccines targeting infectious diseases like the novel coronavirus. And then I'll end by saying some things about the ongoing development of coronavirus vaccines, what's going well, what might not be going as well, and what might be a repetition of some of the problems we encountered with Zika and with Ebola vaccines. We're seeing some of the things that didn't go so well perhaps happening again, and at any point I'm happy to take questions. So let me revisit that idea that vaccines are a form of technology, because I think there are two important things about about this. And I already alluded to the first one, which is this idea that intellectual property, and particularly patents, are a form of law that regulates a very diverse body of inventions. And vaccines, even though they have very particular characteristics from a market perspective, as I'll get to in just a moment, vaccines are a form of technology that are subject to most of the intellectual property rules that we're familiar with in many areas, from cell phones to early on the development of things like chairs and desks. So vaccines are not regulated in particular from an innovation perspective by an ad hoc body of law, and we have some problems there. We often talk about patent exceptionalism. We talk about perhaps the super exceptionalism of biotechnologies within patent law, but vaccines are really a non-family within biotechnologies. And yet they're subject to market forces and to IP forces to some degree that perhaps I've argued, and I continue to argue, don't mesh very well with the nature of vaccines. And this is why. As a form of technology, most of the vaccines that you're probably thinking about during this pandemic are really simple forms of technology. They are not particularly complex. They're not particularly new, the things that we do these days to create the vaccines that we need to flatten the curve in this epidemic, or many of the vaccines under development for diseases that are similar to coronavirus in the sense that they cause these massive, or they may cause these massive outbreaks. This is what most vaccines do. You kill a virus and you mix it with a few other components that, in essence, make sure that the vaccine will last. So they will make sure that it will last longer than it would under normal circumstances, and they make sure it's more potent than just by relying on viral matter. So you have a concoction of different things that are put together, and you either kill the virus or you attenuate the virus. You inject that mix with, some stabilizers, sugars, and things like that, some adjuvants, and you inject that mixture into somebody's bloodstream, and you hope that it will generate an immune reaction, and thereby you cannot become sick from that particular strain of the virus. I'm sure you've heard a lot about this recently, but this, I think it's really, really important, because these are very simple forms of biotechnologies. Now you see the parentheses there with the word others in there. There are some types of vaccine development underway that rely on more sophisticated types of technology. There are things like cancer vaccines and DNA vaccines under development. And a lot of the technology might become useful in the medium to long term, but really the majority of vaccines that we have, pretty much all vaccines we have, rely on one of these methods. You kill the virus or you attenuate the virus, and a few other processes that we have been familiar with for centuries. Now, the practice of immunization is something that comes from even before medieval times, from China. It was known throughout the Middle Ages. So this idea, the process itself, is not particularly new. And a lot of what we're doing today in 2020 is related to what we were doing in the 1940s and 1950s as the big wave of vaccine development took place. So think about the polio vaccine and other things that came to market.
Can I interrupt just to clarify, to unpack this a little bit? Mm-hmm. And so when we were thinking about this as a technology, I assume that matters obviously from how we think about the legal tools. It also matters from a disciplinary perspective as to which branch of medicine or science this falls into. And just to clarify the slide a little bit, you're not just simply talking about the process, which has its own meanings within patent law. You're talking about the product or the composition of matter that is the vaccine itself.
I'm really talking about everything. So I
Okay.
think in a few moments, I do have a slide that shows a number of patent applications that attach to different types of vaccine technology. And by that, I will mean, and I mean now, everything from process patents to
Okay.
product.
So the technology is both the
The
tool
technology.
and the application of the tool. I mean, the
Correct.
yeah, okay.
And this is not as fragmented
Mhm.
as in the case of, say, your cell phone, in which literally you have dozens, if not hundreds, of patents, but you still have several patents covering the same vaccine.
Now, when we're thinking about the the vaccine itself, we can think about it in lots of different ways as well. You mentioned the biotechnology, which is suggesting maybe genetics. There's also a biochemistry or maybe even a pure chemistry to this. Does that matter in terms of how we think about the vaccine for what we'll talk about or what you'll talk about in a few minutes, the legal regulation?
It matters that is a biologic. I want to say I have a slide. There we go. That
Okay.
doesn't segue. It does matter that it is a biologic. It
Okay.
matters from a regulatory perspective. Within the FDA, we have different centers. So vaccines are regulated under the center that deals with biologics. It matters beyond the regulatory sphere. So it matters in the sense that vaccines are made out of living things, or as you saw, killed pathogens, that makes them finicky. So they are indeed a very relatively simple form of technology. And when you think of biotechnology, normally our mind goes immediately to very complex processes and very complex combinations of products. I don't think vaccines fit that portray very well. They're just simpler than that. At least the ones that are commercially available tend to be simpler than that. Another thing that I think matters here is that drug development in general and the regulatory approval towards the later stages of R&D is very time and resource consuming. And I don't want to minimize the costs of vaccine development. One of the things that I think we'll see today is important is that the private sector alone cannot develop a vaccine. They can do the basic research, but then they have to transfer that technology out of the public sector. That being said, as long as we have minimal research on a related pathogen, when we get something new, like the novel strain of the coronavirus that emerges, as long as we have a vaccine in the family, normally we're able to adapt the technology pretty quickly. So that's what you're seeing in this outbreak. I know that 12 months to 18 months, which is what you're hearing, I think right now in the media about the timeline for the coronavirus vaccine, sounds like a significant chunk of time. In the world of vaccine development, that's nothing. A new vaccine takes longer than that to be developed, except in cases like this. And we saw this with Zika, and we saw this with Ebola. Vaccine R&D occurs on an expedited timeline because, again, the technology is relatively simple to the point that by going to similar processes and components we've developed before, we can adapt the technology. So it's, I think, one of the areas, and this is not applied to all vaccines out there, but the ones that I'm talking about today, the ones that are relevant for an outbreak like the one we're experiencing right now, there's a phenomenon of technology adaptation. And as you can imagine today, that also means that the adaptation takes place within a universe where patent rights are pervasive. So that's sort of the landscape.
And so the 18-month window that we're talking about, or that includes both the development of the vaccine and any clinical trials, right? So just to give you, if I'm correct in that is quite a fast time track.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And clinical trials, I have a picture towards the end. Clinical trials have begun. So Seattle was the first place in the US where clinical trials for coronavirus vaccine candidates, and candidate is what we call a vaccine that's being tested, is the ones we're now seeing in clinical trials. We think it's going to be viable. We think there's a pretty good shot that vaccine might gain regulatory approval. So there are a few candidates for coronavirus vaccines targeting this particular strain of coronavirus right now. So the first trial started in Seattle less than a month ago, which is remarkably remarkably
Fast, yeah.
fast. Many of you are probably not familiar with not just the name, but also the face of Dr. Fauci on TV. At some point in early February, he was being very vocal about how it was hard to get vaccine R&D going, particularly in the idea that attracting the private sector, the large pharmaceutical companies that do have the manufacturing capabilities to develop, to manufacture and produce and commercialize vaccines, he complained for a very short period of time in early February about, oh, it is frustrating. I believe that's the word he used, saying, you know, they don't want to come to the table. And then very quickly they did come. So all of this is remarkably fast, even, you know, faster than what happened with Ebola and with Zika. And there are reasons that are probably extra legal for that, but this is all a very, very expedited timeline. That being said, I'm still not sure that we're going to get vaccines as fast as some of the predictions out there, but it's important to keep in mind that this is a very, very fast timeline, and you see the FDA acting accordingly, right? We are not, I don't think we're cutting corners here, but there are mechanisms in place at the regulatory level to make sure that when a situation like this arises, we are able to test vaccines in human populations faster than we otherwise would.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
So this is sort of an overview of the timeline, I hope of the technology itself. I'm going to go through a number of other things that are specific or distinctive about vaccines that I think will help me at least convey an idea that vaccine development under normal circumstances is not an attractive prospect for most companies. And we've talked about a couple of these things, and I'll just revisit the idea that vaccines are biologics. And one thing that's common to all biologics, in addition to the fact that they're made out of living things, is that they are finicky. They are less stable, characterizable than normal drugs and Tylenol or drugs that we call small molecule drugs, simpler forms of drugs that are chemically synthesized. So vaccines do belong to this category of large, structurally large drugs. They're made of living things. And normally that means a number of things in this space. It means that it's very hard to replicate the original biologic. It means that's bullet point number 2. It means that until very, very recently, there was no competition for the first biologic that would enter the market. There was really there wasn't a regulatory pathway for not generics, because we don't really have generics in this area, and I'll say more about that in just a second. But until the Affordable Care Act, so that's why you see 2010 there at the bottom, we didn't have a regulatory pathway as we had for traditional or small molecule drugs to bring competitors to market. So this is not specific to vaccines. This is something that all biologics share, but this derives from the characteristic that these are finicky drugs. So even if you sometimes see the final products, if you see the approved biologic, you might not be able to fully reverse engineer it as you would a small molecule drug. And that's why you see the word generic there. Right. In quotation marks, you really don't have generic versions of biologics. You might get cheaper versions of biologics. They're called biosimilars, and there's a category that we currently don't have anything in that category, but would be the one of interchangeable biosimilars. So this is just to give you an idea from both the scientific perspective, but also from a regulatory perspective. Vaccines fit a box that we treat differently from the box where conventional drugs, the ones that have populated our system the longest, occupy. So there's that generic difference. Now, I don't think this is the most distinctive thing about vaccines, again, because there's such a simpler form of biotechnology. I don't think that there are many issues here at the level of incentives, meaning the number of players that we're able to attract to the R&D side of things, or I don't think that these characteristics of vaccines have anything in particular to do with transactional IP problems we might have towards the later stages of vaccine R&D. What I think really sets vaccines apart from most other types of drugs is, the information in this slide. So markets for vaccines, and again, there's not a single market for all vaccines, right? There are different types of markets for vaccines, but they either are too small or are perceived as being too small. And this, I think, is the first trait that sharply distinguishes vaccines from many other types of drugs out there, especially in the biologic space. Some of the world's best-selling drugs are biologics. So for instance, you might have heard or seen ads for Humira. That's a biologic, a large molecule drug. So technically the same category as a vaccine, but it's a bestseller drug because it targets a bunch of different conditions. There's enough demand throughout the US, Canada, Europe, so many different geographical markets for this vaccine. So we're talking about something like 20 billion a year with a B. That's not the case with vaccines. There are some vaccines that fare well from a commercial perspective. So the ones that I would hope most people watching, if not all people watching this webcast, are familiar with, if nothing else, because they got that vaccine at one point in their lives. So things like the measles, mumps, rubella, for instance, those are vaccines on the schedule. They're recommended. So there's a market for these vaccines. There's demand. There's constant demand, and there's supply. Now, we know what happens when demand for some of these vaccines plummets. That's what we saw recently last year and the year before as pockets of populations in the Pacific Northwest or in New York did not consume the vaccine in sufficient quantities to trigger herd immunity, which is the level at which collectively a particular population needs to be at in terms of getting the vaccine, for the infection not to spread to the point that it will cause an outbreak. So from things like measles, we're talking of something in excess of 80% of the population needs to be vaccinated. In the case of the novel coronavirus, we suspect it's something between 60% to 80% of the relevant population needs to be immune in some way, either through a vaccine or having recovered from coronavirus infection, for herd immunity to kick in and then infection to, it will still occur, but it will not be sufficient to cause the type of outbreaks that we're seeing right now. So in general, unless we're talking about a vaccine like the one for measles or other things in the childhood or adult recommended schedules, which you can consult if you go to the CDC's website, for instance, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, there's a demand problem, or real or imaginary. And I think in many cases it's real. So my previous webcast here was about the Ebola and the Zika vaccines, which we didn't have, and we still don't have an approved Zika vaccine. Now, put yourselves, in your old shoes back in 2015. Would you have, even if it was available, how many of you would have had a need for an Ebola vaccine or for a Zika vaccine? An important answer here might be that if you are in any way related to the army, or if you travel often to one of the places where Zika and Ebola were and are traditionally endemic too, maybe it would have occurred to you, or maybe your medical provider would have suggested that you were indicated for the vaccine. But most people, probably would not be in need of the vaccine. So that's one of the big problems that sets apart vaccines from other types of drugs, that they are very effective as public health instruments, but the market might be very, very small. If the market is enormous, like in the current outbreak, odds are we don't really have a vaccine. I mean, this took us all by surprise in its particular embodiment. We have been hearing for a long time from experts in the medical field to Bill Gates in his TED Talk, suggesting that an outbreak like this was coming. We just didn't know what it was going to be and when it was going to happen. So when there's something that spikes demand for vaccines, like what we're seeing right now, it's often too late, right? We are, and this is a pretty positive scenario in terms of vaccine development, when we're told, oh, it's something that might be 18 months away, that's not going to help us for the next 18 months, right? So when the demand for coronavirus vaccines of this particular strain spikes, it's actually too late for the process itself to occur. We might be able to mitigate some of the effects of the outbreaks next year if the vaccines do enter the market or are administered in some form, but that's the perennial problem with the market for vaccines.
Can I follow up on 2 points from that?
Sure.
One is, I think there's been some talk about whether this might become a seasonal vaccine, like the standard flu vaccine. Wouldn't that change the market analysis, since every year or so, or 6 months, whatever it might be, the demand would be recurring, just like with a flu vaccine? Or I mean, I guess with some of the other vaccines you mentioned, I can see why the market would be too small. I guess you see this with the pneumonia vaccine as well, in terms of the size. So, but what about the seasonality of this potentially? Wouldn't it be like a flu vaccine? And then the second question is, there was some controversy over Gilead's and the treatment of the vaccine as an orphan drug.
Yeah.
Is that related to what you're saying there? It sounds like it would be, but would you want to talk about that as well?
Sure. I'm happy to. So, to your first point, that's absolutely a possibility. And I would treat flu vaccines differently from most vaccines, even because flu vaccines split into two big categories. So there's the flu vaccines that we are familiar with, that many of us might get every year. And, it's, we tend to look at Australia to know, because of the way the seasons are flipped, to know if it's going to work well in a particular year or not. That's one thing. That would put flu vaccines into more of a category that resembles the MMR vaccine. So vaccines starting measles, right? Every year there will be young populations in need of that particular vaccine, we know, of the MMR, and same thing with the flu, right? And it's a growing market, the flu vaccine. So if you think about this in terms of happy stories and sad stories, as far as demand for vaccine goes, I think flu vaccines go on a very small box of happy R&D stories. Then there's something more about the flu vaccine, which is the pipeline, the R&D pipeline for a universal flu vaccine, and we don't quite have that yet. So that's a different type of story. Would there be demand for that? In all likelihood, there is more funding and more efforts, R&D efforts, around that particular project than around many other types of vaccines that we need. But there's less, I'll call this, for lack of a better word, goodwill, and from an R&D perspective behind those projects. So I think there's a distinctive possibility that the novel coronavirus vaccine, when it hits the market, if by then the virus has become more of a seasonal thing that resembles the flu, then I think the novel coronavirus vaccine will go into that box. The problem, I think, right now, and it might be one of those situations in which you have a problem, and then there's some hope in this part of the story, is that how do we prepare for situations like this? It's all very well if the vaccine does become something more akin to a seasonal flu vaccine, but think of the toll of the pandemic and our inability to anticipate that this is the vaccine we should have been developing in the first place, because unlike Ebola and Zika, we did not know of this particular strain of the virus. So we have not really addressed that disjunction yet. I think things have come spectacularly fast from an R&D and funding perspectives into place with the case of coronavirus vaccine. I think there are some things that are not going well, and you alluded already to those things. But I think we need to keep thinking about this disjunction between the massive need for a vaccine right now and the ways our innovation system, and that's why I attempted to characterize vaccines as technology. So we have a default system to incentivize R&D, and the question now is, how does it fare under circumstances like this? This was to your first point. To your second point, that's the part of the story that's not going so well. There's this idea, you might agree or disagree with it, but there's a pervasive idea in contemporary intellectual property, and particularly in the biomedical field, that intellectual property incentives are not enough. Even if you subscribe to utilitarian views of IP that say, particularly in fields like biotechnology, nobody is going to bear the risk of failure, the cost, the time, etc., unless there's some carrots at the end of this process that keeps me going through it. And of course, the default system is the patent system, but there's been this discourse in biotechnology that says that's not enough. So we've seen something that frankly, I would characterize as a non-regulatory design feature. We now see the FDA, we've seen the FDA for a number of years, performing, among its many functions, performing this function of incentivizing innovations through a number of things. There are vouchers that you can get if you are the first innovator to obtain regulatory approval for a drug targeting a particular disease. Ebola, Zika were quickly added to this list of vouchers, for instance. And I don't know if you want me to stop and talk a little bit about the voucher system. I think that just mentioning there's a voucher system.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah, whatever you feel comfortable with. I think this issue of orphan drugs and Gilead is, the one that's been controversial lately.
And the vouchers themselves are controversial. The idea that on top of all of these things are market exclusivity. So a patent in itself is a form of exclusivity, right? It's a form of creating artificial exclusivity as an exchange for your disclosure of information related to an invention for your having persisted through the R&D process. On top of that, and again, this is restricted to the biotech and to the drug field. The FDA awards and administers a system of market exclusivity. So, and that's detached from patent protection. So you might or might not have patent protection at the time the FDA exclusivity kicks in, but FDA is either prevented from looking at an application or cannot approve an application, put the final stamp on it until that market exclusivity runs out. And the gist of it is very, very similar to the idea of the vouchers or other types of incentives. So if you're the first one to bring a particular drug to market, FDA will administer for you this market exclusivity during which no other drugs that would compete with you can be approved and enter the market. So it's the patent system with a twist, right? It's a different regulatory twist on exclusive rights. And the categories that are covered normally by, or the categories that are covered by the market exclusivity system, they're very different, but the unifying thread, I would say, is that these are diseases that we think are underfunded. And a lot of these are critical diseases because they're terrible diseases that affect something like a handful of male infants in the US, or things that we used to think of as neglected tropical diseases. And I would contend the term is losing its meaning because most diseases, as we see now, are becoming, somewhat globalized. So things like that. So Ebola, Zika, also orphan diseases, which is what you were talking about. And so Gilead very quickly came to the FDA for orphan disease designation, meaning that because the vaccine or because the technology itself, and doesn't have to be a vaccine, this could be any type of drug, targeting any population that's deemed to be under 200,000 patients in 1 year in the US, that's an orphan market. So that's a market in which we think, again, it's the idea of the market being too small. Our assumption would be that there's not enough incentives for companies to invest in this area.
Okay.
Now, that does not hold true right now, right? It's a
Right.
different type of incentive at play, but we see multiple companies in the US and China, all across Europe, coming up with coronavirus-related drugs, vaccines, treatments, etc., etc. So this is not what the system was designed to do.
Okay. Yeah.
But there's a lot of gamesmanship, not just under pandemic situations, on a regular basis. I'm on team, very critical of things like vouchers. I don't fully buy into the regulatory exclusivities. Yaniv Khaled has written about this, and one of his papers, says patents and regulatory exclusivities. Do we really need both? I am sympathetic to the idea that we need big pharma, and big pharma is important. Without big pharma, we don't bring these drugs to market. But I think we've gone a bit too far. And what happened with Gilead, I think, it's just one embodiment of systemic problems. And the outcry was so vocal in this particular case that actually they told the FDA that they did not they were not pursuing orphan drug designation anymore. So this is just one example of how things don't work the way
Okay.
we assumed they would.
Okay. I was just trying to give it in the context of the market being too small, so that was very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, so there's that in the case of vaccines. There's also, in the case of vaccines, a couple of other things that I think it's probably worth mentioning here. Unlike some of the drugs, and many of these drugs might be eligible for some of the things we're talking about, for regulatory exclusivities, for additional layers of incentives, many of the vaccines out there, you get them once, maybe twice, maybe 3 times if you need your boosters, and then you might have long-term or lifelong immunity. So if we're thinking about this from a market forces perspective or from an economic perspective, if you're a rational player, economically motivated, vaccines are not going to be the most appealing thing for you to invest on. Because if you think about repeat drugs, so things like, and I'll stick to the example of Humira, another biologic, right? If you're thinking about, where to put most of your resources in order to maximize profit, but also to serve the largest populations out there, you're not thinking vaccine, because vaccines are not repeat purchases in many, many cases, or if they're repeat purchases, that's a very limited. It's 1 plus booster, 1 plus 2 boosters. So there's that. Adding to all this complexity and distinguishing between types of biotechnologies, there's that. And then there's the hidden side of this all from an economic calculation perspective, which is, how do you prove that by administering a vaccine, you've avoided certain costs to the health system? So we're hearing right now about how the US and a lot of countries are out of beds, or soon will be out of beds, for the sheer number of patients that we need to treat with the new coronavirus. We're hearing about scarcity of things like ventilators and things that are critical to treat these patients. All of this comes at a cost, having the beds, having the ventilators, and just putting aside for a moment the sheer horrible shortages that we're encountering or about to encounter right now. From an economic perspective, if somebody does not enter or does not go to the hospital to be treated for coronavirus, that's a positive side on the economic strain that a particular disease puts on health systems. Now, how do you measure that? It's very, very difficult to do that, to estimate how many people were immune either through a vaccine or through herd immunity at a lesser variant of a lesser serious variant of the disease. So how do you measure this economically? It's really, really difficult. So if we're trying to think about the future and how we need to get more resources geared towards vaccine R&D, there's something there that from an economic calculation perspective is very hard to to quantify, to say, you know, next time we have an outbreak, this is how much we will save if we have a vaccine developed early on as opposed to later on due to resource scarcity, for instance. So there's a problem of difficulty in valuation, and often that translates into undervaluation of the economic impacts of vaccines. And then something else that perhaps this is not the best moment to illustrate this, because a lot of people are now hoping for a vaccine in this pandemic, but often vaccines are undervalued as a public health tool. So the literature, the experts say, oh, this is the most cost-effective way of preventing disease, of lessening the burden of disease. And then at the same time, last year, the WHO said lack of trust across the world in vaccines is is one of the top 10 problems we are facing from a public health perspective. So on the one hand, there's the established notion that vaccines, critical elements of public tool, are needed. And on the other hand, we've seen that unfavorable attitudes towards vaccines have increased over the past few years. I think that makes for a very complex market. And then something on top of all of this, I put down fear factor as sort of a generic category. Vaccines, sure, there are oral vaccines and a few other ways to deliver the vaccine, but some people are afraid of needles, and there are some visceral reactions to the idea of having the pathogen that's injected into your body and somehow becomes a part of you. And then in the case of vaccines and vaccines alone, there's the very unfortunate fact that there have been publications with a veneer of scientific credibility that have published studies that are now retracted, but that keep circulating, the message keeps circulating through social media and other networks. So there are some connections that are unfounded in science, but made between vaccines and some detrimental health effects in the perspective of those who still perpetuate these views that we don't see elsewhere. And that's all of this together, this idea that the technology itself is regarded with suspicion by some indicated population contributes to different outbreaks from the one we're seeing today. So what we saw with measles last year and the year before falls under this bracket. And this is something that you don't see with other drugs and with other biologics, right? No, you don't see this type of discourse with drugs targeting autoimmune diseases, at least not at the extensive level you see here. So that's yet something that distinguishes vaccines from other forms of biotechnology.
And so the alternative that we're thinking about to vaccines obviously is some sort of treatment after the fact. I mean, I think we're getting some sense of that with COVID-19. But I mean, would it be fair to say that sort of ex ante avoiding the disease through vaccine is generally better than, and again, I'm being very broad and here I recognize, but it's generally better than ex post treatment? I mean, obviously having a cancer vaccine would probably be better than having to go through whatever cancer therapies we have now.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely correct. So from a health system perspective, you'd rather, again, remember vaccines, I'm not saying they are completely inexpensive to develop, but they are, both from a development perspective and from a manufacturing perspective, they are cheaper to develop and manufacture than many other drugs out there that we produce massively. So these are cost effective. From a health systems perspective, it's better from an economic perspective and from a public health perspective to deploy vaccines as opposed to treatments. Now, if you think back to the idea that we're still pretty much relying on the patent system, and we've now discussed a few other types of regulatory exclusivities as incentives to R&D, you can imagine that things are not going to fare tremendously well unless there's something like a pandemic that shifts interests and changes the playing field. So you mentioned cancer. I'll use cancer as an example in a slightly different scenario. So my students are horrified every year when I assign the Austin Fract piece in the New York Times. And the title is something along the lines, it's more profitable to develop something that addresses a stage 4 cancer for a couple months than something that targets different forms of stage 1 cancer. There's more money to be made at the end of that timeline than at the beginning, if you're addressing this from an economic and profit-driven model, which is not always the case, right? There are multiple instances out there, and I have a slide towards the end in which I hope to illustrate that. So this is not just saying this is the universal approach, but from a pure economic perspective, that's how the system is designed to work. If we're thinking about rational players, and companies have to be predominantly rational, right? If nothing else, that's how the system is going to play out. And you see that in the field of vaccines. I have a number of scenarios, and this might be a good time to transition to those if you're okay with that.
Yes,
I have
absolutely.
a number of scenarios. So this sort of is the research I've done between the first webcast in 2017 and now, which just briefly looks at IP rights associated with vaccines, and I'll show you what the landscape looks like. And while I'll show you that landscape, there's a slide in there that is going to chart the number of vaccine manufacturers in the US market, the US market being one of the largest for vaccine manufacturing throughout the 20th century. And I think that slide in particular illustrates the problem with vaccines and how they're perceived as an economic good. So you'll see that we used to have dozens of vaccine manufacturers, and now we have a handful. And there's a myriad of reasons for that. And here it is. But I think this tells you how vaccines are perceived from an economic perspective. So the graph, I know the numbers are small, and it's the number of vaccine manufacturers in the US. So it begins in 1903. That is actually more of a formal beginning because we had vaccine manufacturers, particularly along the East Coast in the Pennsylvania, New Jersey area and elsewhere in the country in the late 19th century. But 1902 is when regulations for biologic products were stiffened up. So we start counting in 1903 as we begin licensing these manufacturers. And you see that by 1916, we're approaching 40. By 1940, we've exceeded 50. And if you think in terms of vaccine innovation, this is the polio era in which we finally get a vaccine, and the disease pretty much disappears, right? So this is what some people call the golden age of vaccines, that first part of the curve. Some of them call the golden age of vaccines the 40s, late 30s to 40s, 50s, perhaps up to the very early 60s. But this is the number of players in the market. And then it goes down. And it goes down for a number of reasons, but you see that by the 1980s, we're already under 20. And then in 2000, the early 2000s, we get down to 4 or 5, which is where we're at right now. Many things led to this, but vaccines do have a reputation for not making companies any money right now. And if you look at the business plan of some companies, you actually see that in writing. We don't expect to make any money on this vaccine. And attrition from the manufacturer perspective was attributable to a number of things that don't have to do necessarily with pandemics, but speak to some of the undervaluation problems we've talked about. At least nominally, to liability concerns with vaccines, which we tried to address through legislation in the 80s, but the legislation, at least from a market entry perspective in terms of manufacturers, seems to have had no effect whatsoever. So there were reasons, but one big reason is that discovery and development of vaccines that are substantially different from the vaccines that we've been talking about. So vaccines targeting Ebola, Zika, and now the new coronavirus is actually very difficult. So you were mentioning earlier cancer vaccines. Apart from HPV, which is a particular type of vaccine, we don't really have cancer vaccines. Right. We don't know how to do this. So the next frontier for vaccines, the things we kind of expect to see over the next decades, but we're not quite there yet from a scientific perspective, it's just become very difficult scientifically and hence very costly to innovate in this field. And that's why you see the charts doing this. And that's why, and it's not a uniform reaction, of course, but that's why you see the label of, this will lose me money attached to most vaccines this day. And same thing here. So this is 20th century, the 21st century, and this charts the number of drug approvals in the US. So the new drugs approved by the FDA, and the dark blue is biologics. So this category of large molecule drugs we've been talking about, excluding vaccines. Then the lighter blue is new molecules that have gained regulatory approval. And then the tip of each one of the years, you'll see that medium blue, that's new vaccines approved in the US market. And you can see proportionally what it looks like. And you can see that in years like 2004 and 2015, there were no new entrances in the US market. And I should mention that the data for 2018 is not yet complete. So that, I think, puts things into perspective again in this very utilitarian view of things like the patent regime and the FDA exclusivities and the like. And I don't want to put too much faith into these graphics. It's a nightmare, and that's part of what I'm doing now. It's a nightmare to track the number of patents that attach to a vaccine technology. And as we had discussed before, we're talking about product patents and process patents. But as you see, the number of manufacturers do this, so it spikes in the mid 20th century and then it goes down. You see patents, these are just first filings in the US, but this is a trend we see worldwide. You see that they are relatively low through the 30s and 40s. So when we have that spike in the number of players that populate the market, and as the players leave the markets through the 60s and 70s and 80s, the number of first filings on anything that has been categorized as vaccine-related technology, it spikes. So that's sort of the story there. And of course, this is not very granular, but I think it speaks to the rise of a patent culture also in this field. So it's a story that's similar to what we've seen in other fields, and it holds true worldwide. So this is WIPO. These are WIPO calculations. So same thing here, people applying for patents on vaccine technology. Also worldwide, as manufacturers exit the market, the patent culture becomes more dominant. And these are actually number of vaccine-related patents granted by the US PTO. So same thing here. You saw the graph that showed that after the late 40s, 50s, manufacturers began leaving the market pretty quickly, but at the same time, those who remain become fairly active in the 60s and then very, very, very active from the 80s onwards, with a spike towards the end of the 20th century.
Well, those are vaccine developers, right? Not necessarily just manufacturers. So manufacturers.
The players.
For the patents.
No, for the patent, it's developers,
yeah.
right? But it's a consolidated market, right? And it's a market that's expected to suffer from a number of limitations, and it's not going to endure a lot of competition. So that just shows that whoever is left on the development side of things is also inhabiting this patent culture.
Yeah, I mean, the story that I see here is that the manufacturing market in the US is becoming more concentrated, and that may be because of consolidation. It may be because of, we're not looking at manufacturers overseas, but maybe a lot are moving overseas. But it's an interesting story you're telling.
I don't want to squeeze too much out of the data that I have so far, because we have a number of issues in this area. When you look at FDI data, there are some mislabeling activity there. Vaccines that have a new name or something that leads the agency to classify them as new, they were not exactly new. Um, so it's going to take me years to go through all of this, but I just wanted to give you an idea of how things were back in the 50s, in one of these golden ages of vaccine. I call it vaccine innovation in the sense of, new vaccines came to market, we eradicated or are close to eradicating related diseases. I think it's telling. I think there's also a public sector story in there. It's no coincidence that this is happening, shortly before we get a man on the moon. It's that time where there's more generous funding for public sector supported research than today, and that's a reality. But I think that's important to recognize. This is just to put things in.
Don't understand. Yeah. No.
In context. And then I actually showed this in 2017 when I said, well, this was what happened with Ebola and Zika, and this is what I worry about. So this is lifted from the WHO guide to pandemic preparedness, and they have a list of pathogens that this was, literally what I used in my previous webcast, and it talked about things we expect will cause an outbreak in the near future. And there were a number of pathogens on this list, and you can see already SARS, which is the family coronavirus belongs to, listed there. So they sort of guessed it. And the category that I said last time, I'm scared of, the novel agent, still there, right? A new severe infectious disease or a new form of something we know about, case in point, SARS. And what the WHO said at the time, there's a lack of vaccine R&D. And more extensive even than that, they said there's no vaccines, no treatments, and few diagnostics available when vaccines are needed. So unfortunately, that is us right now, which I think brings me to my final topic, which is how we're doing in terms of coronavirus vaccines. This is just one example. There are more. And this goes back to this idea of the patent culture. And I don't mean here to be critical in the sense of, saying this is a good or a bad thing. But there are patents related to coronaviruses. And this is really, really important because there's been a lot of, I think, of misinformation, if not disinformation, online and in print and elsewhere saying, this is patented, this new virus is patented, and that's not the case. First, you cannot patent a virus as is to begin with, but these are other forms of the virus, related forms of the virus, but not the particular one that we're dealing with. So early on, during the early stages of the outbreak, there was a lot of insinuations that the virus had been created by a number of, or engineered by a number of entities ranging from governments to Bill Gates or entities affiliated with Gates and the Gates Foundation. This is because people go on Google patent and type coronavirus and this pops up. So there are indeed relevant patents on technology needed within the family, within the viral family, or things we need to develop vaccines and vaccine technology. This is not one of them, but I just wanted to leave the warning out there that there's a lot going on and circulating online that portrays everything in this area as having already been patented, and that's not the case. Now, we talked about, so Gilead and a few other examples in the case. This is what I was referencing when I said, speedy developments of candidates and clinical trials have already begun. One of, this is yet another, this is from yesterday. So this is a company that's very often involved in the development of vaccines, and they've partnered with BARDA. And so BARDA, a government agency that has an interest in things like national security. So again, because the Army used to deploy a lot of Army and intelligence, a lot of people overseas to areas where pathogens that are not endemic to the US cause disease. So those agencies have always had a big interest in funding vaccine development. So we see that happening now, BARDA being one of not just partners, but funders in this particular area. So that is good news. And I'm going to jump to this one. This is possibly one of the greatest changes since I last spoke here. This is a public-private partnership that was created after Ebola, after the Ebola outbreak, and only works in the field of vaccines. So they sponsor, they fund, they collect money and they fund vaccine R&D and vaccine alone. So it's a distinctive public-private partnership for that. So this was a response to the lack of IP preparedness, I called it back in the day, diagnosed by the WHO. So now we are trying to address the landscape in terms of incentives by having an entity like CEPI that's able to fund vaccine R&D very, very quickly, not only on a regular basis because they've been operating even before the outbreak, but they've been one of the major funders and catalysts for the collection of money during the outbreak. So they've been heavily involved in the funding of a great deal of vaccine projects during the coronavirus pandemic. So that's the good news side of the story. There you go.
Could you just fill in a little bit of the details of public-private partnership, right, CEPI? So would you like to describe a little bit more detail? We have some time, so.
Oh, we do? Okay.
Yeah, there's no rush. I mean, we have some time.
Right.
Maybe 5 to 10 minutes, yeah.
Okay. So this ties back to what we've already discussed. The public sector is very, very important in the field, in many areas of biotech, but particularly in the field of vaccines, as they do a lot of basic research. I addressed that in my previous podcast with Ebola and Zika, the public sector having been very involved in that, but they're just structurally and in other ways incapable of seeing R&D through the pipeline in the case of vaccines. So a private sector partner is always needed. That's something we've known for a long time. Something that we've witnessed from really the turn of the century is this phenomenon that is happening, and this is not restricted to biotech or even to medical technologies at large. We're seeing this in a number of areas, but for the sake of brevity, I'll just speak about what's happening in the medical space. So around the year 2000, we began seeing not just one player or one agency in the private sector and one or two private sector players come together and agree to develop and commercialize a medical product. We've seen large-scale public-private partnerships. So we've gone from having just a couple, literally a couple in the health space, to having about 60 by the last time I counted. CEPI is the first one that's entirely devoted to funding vaccine development. And I think CEPI illustrates what the partnership might look like. So there are dozens and dozens of players, both from public sectors around the world and in the private sector. CEPI, the government of Norway and several other governments are involved, and they collect money through that set of streams. Then you have companies they partner with. So GSK, GlaxoSmithKline, is an unusual partner here. CEPI has been funding a lot of R&D at the lower level in terms of how big a pharmaceutical company is. So the idea is that we now, instead of having just a limited number of players, we have a large set of players, both public and private, at the transnational level, which frankly is what you need in cases like this. That's how you can mobilize resources very quickly when you have an outbreak like this. And I would say that even though CEPI is one of a kind in that it specializes on vaccine R&D, and it was a direct response to what was perceived as a severe infrastructural problem we had in vaccine R&D, there are a number of public-private partnerships in the health space that fund a number of things, including vaccine work. So one of the largest public-private partnerships in the world of any kind is the Innovative Medicines Initiative in Europe, and public sector there, it's the European Union behind a lot of what they're doing. So this is good. This is something that's relatively new, CEPI very new, but the idea of public-private partnership relatively new, something that emerged really in the 21st century. I will say this is not the cure to all of our problems. So, for instance, the Innovative Medicines Initiative lasts, for determined periods of time. And as you talk to them as one of the funding periods. So the third one is about to begin now. As a funding period comes to an end, and you're talking to the funders and to the people working in these organizations, and they will tell you, we don't know if we'll exist 3 years from now. So there are some structural limitations. There are some imbalances between the private and public sectors at the negotiating level. It's probably a topic for a webcast in
Yeah.
itself. But there's some good news. There are some caveats there as well.
Well, thank you, Professor Rushman, for giving us a lot of perspectives. I mean, I think 3 years ago was a wonderful presentation you gave to us, and this has also been very helpful in terms of thinking about the issues. And hopefully maybe we'll revisit this in a few months when we've gone through this.
Well, thank you for having me. I think it's it's a taxing time for all of us. There are some good news. There are some question marks, and a lot of them might be related, right? How much will these vaccines cost? Will they be available to everybody? And that's why it's it's exciting to work in this particular field. But I sincerely I hope you don't need me to do any presentation along these lines anytime.
Yeah, hopefully we'll view this as historical research soon.
Yeah. Happy to come back. I just hope it's under different circumstances. But
thank you. Yeah, we'll put links to your research page and your web page in the comments section below. This will be on our YouTube channel shortly. So thank you again. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.